So I want to, Jeannie, just dive just a little bit further into this idea that I know you place a lot of value in and a lot of emphasis, but that's the idea of using data to drive change and change evaluation. We mentioned, data can be as simple as feedback from a survey or collecting data in a bit of a parking lot idea. But what are some other tactical things you can do exactly? And what type of data can you use? Can you maybe just dig a little deeper on that point and explain to our listeners what that looks like?
Such a good question, and I appreciate that you asked it. Without writing another book, I'm going to suggest that the type of data that you use depends on what the opportunity is. And so, in general, sources of data can include people, which means stakeholders, the target audience. Those are the prime sources for the information that you need. And as you mentioned, surveys are a good way of collecting information. Meetings, which really are kind of a group interview, and those kinds of ways of collecting data. So that's people. Then documents, and documents can be trustworthy data that you find online. However, it really needs to be local data. It can't be something that, say you work for a huge company, in multinational, and you're talking about a change over here in Lisle, Illinois. And the data includes, the location in Sri Lanka. Well, that can be misleading. So you really need to find the local information to guide that change. Other things that can be used for data are artifacts or work samples, observations. So in one community I lived in, there was observations that were done on play areas in the community and what they offered children and teens. And so an observation of those play areas, playgrounds, skate parks, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So four questions you need to ask yourself in order to determine what you're going to use, what kind of information and what kind of methodology you're going to use to collect the data is, what are the questions? What do you need to know? What factors need to be measured to answer the questions? What factors can be measured? And how can they be measured? Sometimes that's a real challenge. And sometimes that's a reason people don't do an adequate job of using data to drive change, because it's difficult to measure things that are not concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final thing is, where can the data be found or from whom? So as you mentioned, there were surveys. I mentioned observations, individual and group interviews, and finally extant data analysis. That is stuff that already exists. You just have to locate it and do an analysis on it.
I really liked your answer, and this is great insight. And, I think this is probably an area when people focus on change, whether it's community change or organizational change or whatever the case may be. I think that the one thing the listeners might learn from your response is the idea of using data is it's an intentional activity. And you got to think about it, and you've got to, you got to figure out, like you said, I think this is great. Number one, it depends on the opportunity. So then that's going to determine what the questions are, and then that's going to determine what factors you need to know. And then you got to think about what factors need to be measured. And then, as you said, then you have to determine, well, where can this data be found? And I liked your point. There's sources of data can include, of course, the people, but that feedback can be qualitative in a sense, right? Feedback like from interviews and meetings. It can be quantitative, which would be, maybe through a survey. It can be through documentation and KPIs, whether it's community or organizational key performance indicators. It can be artifacts, just things that you see, and of course, observations. And then I think one of the points that you make in your book is you use all of those. And then it's a matter of what I would call like triangulation, right? With the resources, you pull all those pieces together and you use that to provide you with objective evidence.
Absolutely. You don't want to use one simple measure, because you want to make sure that what you're seeing accurately. And And
Yeah.
triangulation is one way of doing that.
Yeah. So just to, again, to drill a little further, then can that data then be used to advocate for team engagement? So you looked at all these different resources and you kind of triangulate and you pull the pieces together and you got this set of data. How can that actually advocate for team engagement specifically? Jeanne, you'd mentioned in one of I think it was the second question I asked you, this idea of inclusion and participation. So then how can you use that data to advocate for team engagement?
Well, I think one of the things you need to do is to use that baseline data. You're establishing your starting point, but then you want to frequently share the progress compared to the baseline data based on your team's chosen indicators to maintain that sense of urgency and to celebrate successes, however small. So don't wait till the end.